America, the land of freedom, the land of equality and fairness for its citizens. This is the America that we know and love. But in a time in our not too distant past, not all American citizens were allowed to be free. Instead, they were herded into desolate areas. Men, women, and children guarded by soldiers with guns and spotting towers. This was the time of the Japanese internment by the U.S. government. Can we learn from our mistakes, or are we destined to play out history over and over again? Perhaps by knowing more about how it happened, it'll help us know when it could happen again. The time is pre-war USA in the fertile Sacramento, California Valley, a time of innocence and a prelude to war with Japan.
Well, for me, it was living on the farm, and I was the oldest of 9 children, and we grew up growing strawberries, first of all, and most of the farmers around here, this was all the strawberry community, and it was famous for it. They called it the strawberry capital of the world, and we'd ship from here, Florida, all over. Anyway, my life on the farm was a pretty ordinary, happy life, even though we were very poor, And it was during the Depression, and even then, we had, I think, 5 of us taking piano lessons for 75 cents an hour. And I don't know how our parents ever did that. I marvel at these Issei's, our parents who have really, worked hard and done well.
Yeah, for one thing, I spent 6 years of my life in Japan. I was born in California, but after finishing 3rd grade, I guess it was, I was sent to live with my grandfather, who had just retired as an immigrant from here in Japan. And so, and then I spent 6 years there, and I came back here just a year before Pearl Harbor. So my pre-war experiences, basically, as I remember, is either early childhood or a year before Pearl Harbor. I had lost my ability to speak English while I was in Japan in 6 years, so I was busy trying to relearn English. I was 15 at the time, but I went to a lower level in school in order to concentrate on English. We were all, ordinary Americans, except for my particular background and having been in Japan. We were Boy Scouts, we played sports, cops and robbers, makes sense. Just ordinary, I would say, as youngsters. My father was a gardener, and a lot of the Japanese the adults, immigrants, were gardeners in San Mateo, or nursery. They owned nursery, or they worked at nurseries and that sort of a thing. They farmed previously in this area, as a matter of fact, but after the Depression year, a lot of them moved out of farming and went into the towns where they took up gardening as a profession. And yes, the community was tight because all of our social activities were centered around the Japanese community. There was the Buddhist church and the Christian church, Japanese, social events, movies, Japanese movies. In addition to, of course, we used to go, to see our cowboy movies and all that, before the war. And so much of our social activities was really confined within the community, and we were supportive of each other. There were, people helped each other out in crises, funerals, weddings, etc., or other financial or personal tragedies, and they all came together. So it was a very tight-knit community, and we tended to live close by, I guess. And that was more economic necessity, I think, that, economy sort of selects where you can afford to live. So there were our neighbors, for example, the last neighbors were Chinese on one side. A lot of them were Italians. So I used to think when I was a child that the rest of America was like the Italians, literally.
My parents were, I think, a little bit different. My father was a self-educated man, and every night at the dinner table, after we were all through eating in this tiny kitchen, 11 of us, he'd tell stories, and we'd look forward to his stories. And those stories were Jean Valjean from chapter after chapter. He'd tell us about Bible stories, different Bible stories, Japanese legends, samurai stories. And we looked forward to that every single night, until even to the last day at home. He just told stories to the children. And my mother was, I suppose we can almost say, a typical Issei woman who gave all her life, all her love to her family, everything. She worked hard in the fields all day long alongside my father, and then did all the, the taking care of the family. And of course, as I grew up, I became kind of like a second mother and helped with the dishes and the cooking and the laundry and getting the kids ready for school, the school week and all that.
Life on the farm may have been quiet and peaceful. However, in Japan, there was a plan which would forever affect the lives of all American citizens, whether of Japanese ancestry or not. The attack on Pearl Harbor came unexpectedly and without warning.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Yeah, it was a shock, of course. We knew something was brewing. One reason why we came back to the United States to be with the rest of the family, my older brother and I, was that there might be a war. There were a lot of stirrings. So we didn't want to be separated during the war, so we came back to join our rest of the family in San Mateo. So while there was that sort of an anxiety that something might happen, when it really did happen, on Pearl Harbor Day, it was a shock and anxiety-producing event. We were at across the San Mateo. We crossed the Bay Bridge into Alameda, and we went to cheer our ethnic Japanese American basketball team playing against the Alameda team. And it was during the game that somebody came in with a newspaper. This was past mid-afternoon already, that Pearl Harbor was bombed, and we didn't know where Pearl Harbor was, like the rest of America, I guess. Where is Pearl Harbor? And then we came back by way of San Mateo Bridge, and fortunately we did, because we heard later that people who went back to the city by way of the Bay Bridge were stopped and held for a long time, whereas we were just able to get back to San Mateo. But on the car going back, we were expressing, gee, what's going to happen to us, and what's going to be like? Not at all imagining that we would be interned, but what would be the community's reaction towards us.
The bomb dropped on Pearl Harbor, and then we all became suspect. It was almost like we had dropped the bomb. Anybody who's partly Japanese was responsible. And life became totally different. We'd go to school and our friends aren't talking to us. And it was totally overwhelming. The hatred, the headlines, the discrimination. In the papers, you could see in the pictures here, the paper said, let's put the Japs in concentration camps. We heard the word Japs, and we heard concentration camps constantly, and spies constantly. The newspaper headlines would be, 42 spies picked up in 1 week's time, and they were people like our neighbors, our good neighbors. Mr. Saiki was picked up for, I've forgotten what it was, and Mr. Okazaki by the FBI, and they weren't given any chance to even pick up their, toothbrush. And many of them were just picked off the farms and taken away, and the families didn't know where they were. Now, then we even had the FBI come to our house. There were 3 agents when I came home, and they searched the attic, they searched the bedrooms and under the mattresses and the drawers, and they even went into my bedroom and found my diary and read it from cover to cover, and I was so incensed that I wanted to go and get it from him, but I knew that if I did something rash, that we'd all be in trouble. So anyway, we went through that, and there was a tragic happening. One of our neighbors committed suicide after the investigation by the FBI. So those were the times. It was just totally worrisome.
The next day, Monday, this was a Sunday, and Monday we were all taken to the auditorium where we listened to Roosevelt's speech declaring war. Yeah, the Japanese, without warning, bombed this and that speech, and we did get stared at by our classmates, which became uncomfortable. But the routine went on. In fact, we got involved in selling of bonds or stamps, defense stamps, and we bought them. That sort of thing, the usual thing that kids do in support of the war. So we were just part of that, whole national effort. What really was disturbing for me was I was a member of a Boy Scout, just a recent member, but some of my brothers and friends were, long-time members of the Boy Scout. Our school teacher one day asked all of us who were Boy Scouts to turn in our flashlights and compasses and, knife, whatever, Boy Scouts have. And that was a shocking event that, that even our teacher that we respected, and she liked us. And obviously she got some kind of an order from somewhere to do this, but that hurt us. I could, to this day, it hurts me to think that happened, and we were just kids, and that to think that we were immediately under suspicion of some kind of a unfriendly act.
Suddenly, a country that was not thinking about war had war delivered to its doorstep. The country had changed overnight, and pressure was coming from community leaders who were worried about sabotage from all Japanese to control and monitor their activities. It was this pressure that created the decision for the next major change in our country. On February 19, 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. This would result in the forcible internment of 120,000 men, women, and children.
I thought until the very last minute that this wasn't going to really happen, I had written an essay in high school, What America Means to Me, and it placed in the finals, a year before in high school. And then all of a sudden this happens. It was hard to believe. But when it finally did happen, and it's 10 days you got to leave, with what you can carry, boy, we really had to hustle to get the family ready.
First of all, there was the arrests that were being made by the FBI of community leaders, Japanese school teachers, Buddhist ministers, more than Christian ministers, because Buddhism was considered to be much more pro-Japan or Japan than Christianity. And we began to hear rumors that they're going to knock on our doors any time. And if we had anything to do with any organization that they defined as being pro-Japan, that the adults the father certainly, the male adult might be arrested. And so we were advised, I don't know where the advice came from, but that we should get rid of everything that suggested Japanese books, pictures, things of that sort, or anything else that might be construed to be instruments of sabotage could be used. Radio, shortwave certainly, but radio, any guns and so on. Well, we buried a large number of things, burnt a lot of our pictures, photographs of our relatives and so on, buried a radio, not a shortwave, we didn't have a shortwave radio. And then my father used to collect junks, basically, we used to think. But he had an old gun that didn't even work, but we were afraid that that might be, identified as being some kind of an instrument of hostile act, so we buried them. And I was just telling my friends here that we never went back and dug those up, so I wonder if they're still there. We were renting a place, and so we never went back there. You know, apart from that anxiety that, you know, our fathers might be arrested for having been a member of this or that organization, I was only 14 or 15. I didn't know what hit us, let me put it that way. And it was not until much later in camp when I started to meet people who came to help us, such as the person that I'm going to be talking about tonight, that this should not have happened in America.
We had to report to a train station, old train on the railroad tracks. And that's how we left. But until that time, you know, I thought, gosh, this isn't really happening. And when that train creaked away, my whole world fell apart. I had just become 19, and I just cried and cried and cried. But there were two people standing outside. The windows were all, you know, dirty. This is dirty, mothballed train that they put into service, and there was my elementary school teacher and my piano teacher. Those two were out there waving. No classmates, nobody else that I can remember.
A Greyhound bus was chartered. We were taken to Tanforan, which is just maybe 20 minutes ride from where we lived. We gathered in front of the Masonic Hall, and there was a group of people, non-Japanese, who were there to send us off with, I'm not sure, but I'm sort of thinking that there were some drinks available or something like that, but they were there to send us off, which was a very nice gesture. So although we were, you know, filled with anxiety as to what's going to happen, there was that sense of, you know, community that was still there. So it was not as if that we were suddenly cut off and, you know, chased out, although, you know, the military order, of course, was a very severe one. And it was not until later that we began to realize, and upon reflection, that why is this happening to us, kind of a thing. I think that was generally the attitude. My parents' attitude was basically, this is war. They couldn't become citizens anyway. They were Japanese nationals. This is war with their own country. Can't help. And there is that so-called shikataganai syndrome, we call in Japanese community, that things you can't help. Why, you know, rather just let it rest and just go on, kind of an attitude. And that's, I think, a mechanism of survival for the Japanese.
March 18, 1942. President Roosevelt signs Executive Order 9102, which provided for the removal of people in assembly centers to 10 relocation camps to be built by the Office for Emergency Management. These camps provided a regulated life for its inhabitants, including roll call twice a day, curfews, lights out, and set meal times with no right of assembly, and police could enter a room at any time.
Now, assembly centers were temporary. The permanent camps weren't ready for us, so they put us in these assembly centers. You know, there was Walerga outside of Sacramento, there's Pinedale, Fresno, all over. These Puyallup and the Santa Anita racetracks, where these people were put into these horse stalls, you know, and they had to live there with all that terrible smell until the camps were ready. And so from Pinedale, we were sent, and we didn't know where we were going, I didn't know, into the Arizona desert. That was the Poston camp and the Gila River camp, both in Arizona. And that, we were driven 17 miles into the desert in these open army trucks. You've seen pictures of the army trucks, and that was real. Squeezed in there, and it was 127 degrees that day. And they did nothing over us, but that dust was just blowing, not blowing, just stirred up, and it was so still that just stood there. I mean, we drove through that wall of dust, and that was another eye-opening experience, because we saw this sign saying Poston Indian Reservation, and I said, goody, we're invited on an Indian reservation. We're in high school. I had studied that they had hunting grounds and rivers and all this. And then all of a sudden we realized that this was it. This was the Indian reservation. Sagebrush, dust, occasional windmill here and there, you know. And then we came on to this black tar papered town, and then I passed out. I don't know what, you know, I was so tired and exhausted, and it was so hot that I just, you know, became unconscious. But my mother, I tell you, when I got there and finally joined them, my mother had fixed everybody's mattresses, and these were body bags that they issued us, and then they put a pile of straw just outside of camp, outside of each block, and my mother filled up all these mattresses with straw and had them on each one of our cots.
The military, soon after we got there, announced that they were going to come through the whole camp, confiscating anything that smacked of Japanese again. I don't know why they announced it, but they announced it. So what I did was I said, I can't survive, you know, however long the war is going to last. I can't survive without my dictionary. So I snuck out the night before, and I didn't tell my family members until much later in life. At 2 o'clock, I snuck out and took my dictionaries and put it under. There was a recreation hall which was built high. There was a space underneath. I just put it there. And during the day, you could see it if you know, wanted to, but nobody noticed it. I could see it, and I got very nervous. But that's how I kept my dictionaries throughout the war, and to keep up with my ability to, you know, study Japanese and English at the same time. And I retrieved it when the raid was over. So those are some of the things that we did early in camp. And then the anxiety came as to where they're going to send us from here. Okay, are they going to send us as family or separately or what? And this became an issue. And we were beginning to hear stories about scorpions in Arizona desert and that sort of a thing. And then later we found out that we were going to central Utah, a camp named Topaz near Delta. It's right in the middle of Utah. And so they took a train and went back there. There was one episode on that train ride to the camp in Utah that every time I think about it, and I didn't think about it for a long time, but I was asked to talk about some of my camp experience to a university audience recently. As we pulled in, we were, you know, these were trains that were never used for any passenger service, but they dug it up for transporting us. We had a rest stop somewhere, several in the deserts of Nevada. We got off and did our things and then got back on. And we pulled into Salt Lake City station, and because it was not a regularly scheduled you know, train, we had to wait there for a long time to get connected to the journey down south towards central Utah. Well, a troop train stopped right next to us, and we knew where they were going. They were out going to the Pacific, and we felt sorry for them. We literally, we prayed for their safety. My gosh, these guys are going, young men going off to war. And you know, I felt myself sorry for the guys, and then wish them luck. But they saw us, they stuck fingers at us, catcalls, jabs. That hurt. That really hurt. And when I talked about it for the first time about maybe 6 years ago, that's, you know, 40 years after the war, I broke down just thinking about it. That's how painful it was to suddenly realize that you're no longer with them, you know, even though your sentiments are still, you know, with America, but America was no longer accepting us. That's when I really felt that we were rejected.
There are over 100,000 stories of what life was like behind barbed wire. For some, like Dr. Takashita and Kiyosato, the light of the human spirit and the ability to survive hardship shines forth, hopefully illuminating our way, reminding us that freedom is a precious commodity which must be defended. In light of all that we know now, we must ask the question, could this happen again?
It gets very worrisome with seeing what's happening now. I think of my, grandchildren growing up into this atmosphere. This is why we've been talking to students for the last 12 years, our VFW post, This is our big project, and we go from school to school, and we have one school that's asked us every single year for 12 years, and the others less, but it's growing and growing. We have a slide presentation. We take this display with us, and we answer the students' questions, and they're wonderful. And the teachers are those who ask us are such dedicated teachers, and we don't seem to have any problem holding their attention. They're very interested in what we've learned from this, and it's a terrible way to learn an important lesson. We tell the students this, and we take, like I did, I take my citizenship for granted until they take it away from us, and then you hold on and you begin to realize how important it is.
Of course, I hope it won't ever happen again. That's my fervent wish and hope, that it would never happen again, that I don't want to wish this kind of experience on anyone. If we really believe in our system, okay, and we ought not let it happen again. We let it happen in the past. We should not let it happen. It's our responsibility not to let it happen, and it's not somebody else's, okay? So that's my fervent wish and hope. Unfortunately, there are a lot of circumstances, events, worldwide events, the Gulf War, the current events, and so on, that stir up the same kind of anti-this or that group sentiment. And sometimes I have to, look at myself and watch out. Are you blaming all Arabs for what's happening in Iraq, for example, or the terrorists and so on? I have to remind myself, look what happened to us. So judging from that and knowing how people have publicly said things, the larger community, I'm not too sure whether it would not ever happen again.
Education is an important tool if we're to make good decisions in the future. And members of the VFW Nisei Post 8985 in Sacramento would be happy to bring this important message of the Japanese internment during World War II to classrooms, civic groups, and other interested groups. Thank you for joining us for this program. This is Raleigh Adams inviting you to join us next week for another edition of Northern California Journal.